This is a unique opportunity for us to share the work we've been doing and to talk about a topic we care about deeply, which is the connection between young people and citizenship, especially leading into the 2016 election cycle. We're concerned about this topic for a variety of reasons, but one of the more important ones is concerns about whether young people are engaged and involved in civic life in general, whether the forms in which they've chosen to become engaged in civic life have changed, and with those changes, whether or not there are questions about how safe the structure of our civil society is in terms of volunteerism, in terms of political participation, what happens when this new generation becomes the new voters. And a lot of this coincides with questions about the changing media environment. When we study and look at the question of youth civic engagement, certainly the media is of great import to us, but we situate that work within a larger framework. We're deeply concerned with the roles that parents play and the kind of communication that takes place in households, the kinds of family communication norms that are established. Are families open about communication, or are they more structured and hierarchical? We care about what happens in schools, especially the kinds of civic classrooms and civic spaces in which young people learn to become citizens, oftentimes through civic simulations or controversial issue discussion in the classroom, where learning goes beyond just opening a textbook and actually starts to prepare them for what it means to be involved in civic and public life. Also critical to that and intersecting with that is the connection they have with their peers. And as we know, as adolescents grow up, maybe their parents have a little less influence on them, their peers have a little bit more. Those peer norms, what's acceptable in their peer groups, whether they are centered in a peer group where talking about news and politics is something acceptable, or when talking about news and politics is something that gets you shunned, is an important difference. And all of this obviously then comes into focus through the lens of media. And as communication scholars, we tend to focus on media, but a lot of communication takes place in those other settings too. And so the research we'll share with you actually covers this full domain, talks about families, talks about peers, talks about the media, and talks about the school spaces. When we think about the media in particular, I think it's important to recognize how much the media landscape has changed. We are lucky in a way to be examining these questions in a time when we've seen not just these massive shifts towards digital media, the rise of mobile media, the dominance in some respects of social media, but also the changing media landscape in terms of things like what counts as news. Do you get your news from Fox? Can I bash Fox News? Or I can bash Fox News?
You may.
Whether Fox News is counted as news or whether your news source is Comedy Central. Whether you're getting your news because you consciously seek it out through sources like Google News or through the New York Times, or whether you're encountering your news because your social network tends to post a lot about politics on Facebook. So the patterns through which we're getting the news have changed. It used to be a lot of our exposure to news as young people happened through the family. You saw your mom or dad reading the newspaper or sitting in front of the television set watching the evening news. Young people oftentimes encounter the news on their own, though there's actually questions about how much influence parents still have and how much sway they have, and an issue that we'll come back to. Social media in this mix, I think, is of particular importance. Young people are saturated in social media. 90% penetration among 18 to 29-year-olds, 69% access. It's dominated, Facebook just dominates this environment. Almost all young people are on Facebook, even though we hear about the decline of Facebook in some regards. Certainly young people are complementing with other social media options like Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and others, but Facebook still remains very central to this mix. And it's, in terms of things like Instagram and Facebook, we're seeing a huge growth in terms of young people using not only multiple platforms, but often using those platforms as spaces to talk about politics, to connect with others about politics, and to share their political views in ways that oftentimes expose people within their networks who aren't terribly concerned about politics to political issues and ideas. So when we think about this broader environment of both the shifting media landscape and especially the rise of social media, it's a very fertile ground for us to explore these questions of how young people are becoming socialized into civic life. In terms of young people and their dosage of just kind of the web or social media, the dosage is huge. As this chart indicates, 24% say they are on these platforms constantly. 56% say several times a day. And I think that's true of me. I think that's true of pretty much everyone on the stage. But for young people, that idea of being constantly saturated in this media environment, it gives you a sense that while they may not be watching those evening television news broadcasts or reading the newspaper, they're still heavily consuming media and oftentimes getting large doses of current events or other kinds of content through their navigation through these digital spaces. The contours and the changes in the social media environment and the broader media environment have also paralleled changes that have happened regarding politics in general. So we've seen the rise of popular candidates who are very good at mobilizing digital and social media. When Barack Obama was elected in 2008, Advertising Age named him the Marketer of the Year. That's just how sophisticated his campaign was. In 2012, that apparatus was even more complex with micro-targeting and the ability to really target not just individuals, but to use a variety of channels to reach out to and mobilize groups of voters in key locations. We've seen the shifts also in terms of how young people choose to get involved in politics. Things like the rise of the Occupy movement or the Black Lives Matter movement that are not something that political scientists traditionally would have studied. They would have looked at conventional political behavior, voting, maybe volunteerism, but these kinds of protest behaviors, this kinds of grassroots activism, sometimes direct action or even protest kinds of behaviors are increasingly central to how we understand young people's choices about getting involved in politics and the kind of impact they're having on our political climate and culture. You said I couldn't bash the Republican Party, so I won't say anything bad about the Tea Party, but I will mention how important the Tea Party and their use of social media and digital media are for this changing media landscape. We see tremendous mobilization and use of these digital tools both on the left and on the right. The Tea Party has been able to establish a very strong presence in spaces like Twitter and are very aggressive and vocal about sharing their views, often in ways that result in confrontation with other groups as they proselytize and share their views. So these political shifts, I think, are important to recognize too, alongside those shifts in the media landscape. So what does socialization look like in 2015 and beyond? Well, there's a lot of important shifts that I think we can talk about. And if you look back at the screen, you'll see examples that are more typical, like voting, but then posting that you voted on Facebook and reminding everyone else you did. Now, one of the things we know is when we post that kind of behavior, it makes other people more likely to vote too. There was a Facebook study that actually tested that. And certainly there's more conventional forms of political engagement, like showing up at the voting booth, but there's other forms like the Ice Bucket Challenge, where people are getting involved in fundraising and in forms of civic activism that we would not have traditionally thought of as being political, but nonetheless are, to our mind, deeply civic and really important for how people are choosing to express their values, their concerns, and sometimes bypassing traditional politics and choosing to express their political values through involvement in those kinds of charitable endeavors. We're also seeing things like political consumerism, where people are choosing to purchase certain kinds of products, whether those products are friendly to certain values or causes, or choosing to boycott products that oppose them. So essentially the politicization of the consumer sphere. All of these changes, I think, speak to an important shift in the terrain, and as researchers, substantially expands what we have to consider when we say, are young people getting involved in civic life? But also when we think about the media landscape that may be critical and the communication landscape more generally in the family, in schools, with peer groups, this puzzle gets even bigger. The way we've tried to tackle that question and to look at those changes is through a series of studies, and we're going to share some of the research from those studies with you today. We started in 2008 with a national panel study of parent-child dyads. Now that's a nice formal way of saying we interviewed both a parent and a child in a home. Those children were ages 12 to 17, and it was either the male or female parent of that child that was the other respondent. And we tracked those dyads over a period of time, starting in a pre-election period and then extending into just past the end of the election period, to look at not just the kinds of individual differences, but to actually look at change that occurs within any individual. So looking at, are we seeing the kinds of patterns of media use, the patterns of communication in schools, in households, predicting change in the levels of civic and political engagement we see for young people over time. In 2014, we extended that study and brought in a much deeper set of questions about digital and social media use, and especially mobile media use, which was a concern for the Reynolds Journalism Institute, as young people are consuming more and more media through those mobile platforms, through those handheld devices. We mirrored the general framework, but this time looked at it within a midterm election cycle. And I think the results we'll share with you today mainly come from that first study, but we'll maybe hint at some of the things we're seeing in that second study during the Q&A.